Yasmine Ryan, in anybody's book, is an international journalist. She's worked for media organisations including Al Jazeera, the International Herald Tribune, in New Zealand, France, Lebanon, Qatar, Tunisia, Libya and Turkey. And as a freelancer, she's filed for outlets including The Independent, the Sunday Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, from places as diverse as France, Algeria, China, Italy, the UK, and Bosnia. While on the staff of Al Jazeera English, she was at the forefront of that network's award-winning coverage of the Tunisian uprising and the political turmoil that followed in the Arab Spring. During her time with AJE, she also covered the 2013 French intervention in Mali and the September 2012 attack on the US diplomatic post in Benghazi. Yasmine was a 2016 World Press Institute Fellow in the United States before taking up her current role as Senior Features Editor for trtworld.com in Istanbul, where she manages a team of 6 writers and commissions stories from around the world. Yasmine, welcome.
Thank you.
You had, I suppose, a predisposition towards journalism. Your uncle was the acclaimed, I think in New Zealand, broadcaster, the late David Beatson. Your training here at Auckland University set you up for it too, majoring in politics and French. But what got you into international journalism when most young journalists really want to start their careers in their home country in New Zealand?
I had always wanted to be an international journalist. I was 13 when I decided to be a journalist, and it was I grew up reading a lot about international affairs. I was born in Paris, so my parents had been living in Paris when I was a baby. So I was always, for me, I always dreamt of going out and discovering the world. And yeah, so I had never really looked. I had wanted maybe to be a journalist in the Pacific region, but it's also partly economic realities that working in New Zealand, it's very hard to have an international career. So yeah, so the job opportunities that I've found have been overseas.
Uh-huh. You found yourself in Al Jazeera at a young age. What got you into Al Jazeera English?
So I'd been working at the International Herald Tribune for right after I graduated. I'd been an intern, and I was actually I think the last hire before they started laying off. So I arrived when the newspaper had a bright future. And it was the oldest international newspaper in the world since the late 1800s. Yeah. But when I was there, it was obvious there weren't many opportunities to become a foreign correspondent there because they were just laying people off every year. So then I spent a year freelancing for the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune. And then I'd actually always wanted to work for Al Jazeera as a student at Auckland Uni. The Iraq War was going on, and that's when we started to hear about Al Jazeera Arabic at the time. And I'd seen the film Control Room, and Al Jazeera English got launched in 2006, 2007. So I'd been following the channel, and I'd been watching their coverage of the Gaza War late 2009 when I was a freelancer in Paris, and I was glued to the screen. What they were doing was amazing. And I'd applied for the job. I was waiting about 6 months. I'd given up, and suddenly I heard that I had the position.
And you joined Al Jazeera English at a tumultuous time in the Middle East. You were in Tunisia when the beginnings of the Arab Spring broke. Tell us about that. So
I joined Al Jazeera in October 2010, and it was a little bit sleepy when I arrived. The newsroom, it was a bit lacking something. And they'd had their high moment with the Gaza coverage. But it was still, I think it was still finding itself, the channel. And then by December, so my third month, Tunisia kicked off. And at that time, no one was really following the story. I had been interested in North Africa quite by chance with the Zawi campaign. I had a strong interest in Algeria. I'd been to Algeria for the International Herald Tribune. My first foreign reports are from Algeria.
Ahmed Zawi, of course, was the refugee who came to New Zealand and was imprisoned as a suspected terrorist. You'd followed that as a student, I think.
Yes, yeah. I'd visited him in prison from when I was 21, and we'd co-written the book with Selwyn Manning and Katie Small, and that was my first taste of journalism, and that was in the New Zealand context. And after that, when I went to France, I was just drawn to North Africa. And Tunisia, I'd visited Tunisia under Ben Ali. At the time, you couldn't do any reporting, and I was quite shocked by that. You know, they had giant posters of Ben Ali everywhere, and I made a joke about it, and people backed away from it. So I really felt like I was in George Orwell, 1984, which was different from Algeria, where there's a lot of oppression, but people had a freedom of speech compared to that. And so when it kicked off, in the newsroom, no one really thought it was a story at that time. But I actually had an Algerian friend when I'd been to Algeria for the first time, who had helped me and shown me around and helped me with stories. And he was a friend of a friend, and he had set himself on fire 6 months earlier, and he died. And so I'd looked into that, not as a news story, but as a friend. It was very shocking. And I tried to find out what had happened. And the police had been coming to bulldoze his home because of a corrupt neighbour who wanted the land. And I was asking and I didn't get any reports in the Algerian media. So I was speaking to Algerian friends, like, what happened? And they were like, well, actually, this is happening all the time. Young men are setting themselves on fire as an act of protest. And so when Bouazizi set himself on fire, I was glued to the videos because it was a very personal thing, and I knew it was happening, and I knew it wasn't getting reported. And I saw the first protest with his mother, and there was a small protest, but there was about 100 people. And I knew it was significant because...
Well, any protest was significant, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I had some of the older editors in the newsroom. They said it wasn't a story. It was quite a frustrating time for the first month. And people told me I was getting emotional about it because we had 10-hour news desk shifts, and the editor would be like, no, you can't do Tunisia because it's not a story, it's not an international story. And so I'd stay after, and I'd be speaking to all the cyber activists who were speaking at risk of their lives. Some of the cyber activists I was speaking to were getting imprisoned and tortured. And it was
and the cyber activity, of course, was a phenomenon in the emerging Arab Spring, wasn't it? So yes. You were actually monitoring the beginnings of the wave.
Yeah, and at that stage, I was quite lucky that the head of Al Jazeera Digital, he came from kind of a Silicon Valley type background. So he'd had the foresight to have us all trained in Twitter, which wasn't really a thing at that time. Not in the media industry, but he'd had us trained right my second month. So he'd been like, you have to start using Twitter. And so I'd been looking actually for Algerians on Twitter, but Algerians weren't very active on Twitter. Tunisians were. So I'd started following a bunch of Tunisian activists. So that's why when it started happening, I was seeing it, and it wasn't on the news wires because most international journalists didn't cover Tunisia. There wasn't really any. And they banned me from using the word uprising at first. And we had this news meeting, which is now infamous in Al Jazeera Online, where my manager was supporting me. He said, you have to let Yasmine use the word uprising. And all the senior editors went around and said, no, you can't call it an uprising. It's just protest. And I said, well, you don't know what's happening. You're not following the story in the way that I am. And one of them said, with a very smug smile, he said, Yasmine, if Ben Ali falls, then you can call it an uprising. Because at that point, they thought there was zero. And I said, well, that might happen, which was, I didn't quite believe, but, I was trying to tell them that might happen. And then on the eve that he fell, I had 3 phone calls from top management because I'd done all this work on my own time. And we were ahead of the story. Al Jazeera was ahead of the story. And other news, the New York Times only did their first story on the Tunisian uprising. I think it was January 11th. So right on the final hour, because he fell on the 14th. And we had our traffic was through the roof because everyone was coming to Al Jazeera Online.
At this stage, you were reporting remotely, though.
Yes, because I'd been begging to go, and they were, they still, and actually by that stage, on the 12th or 13th, some other networks had sent people. And suddenly, everyone was coming to me in the newsroom. It was crazy. TV wanted to do the story. They had started to do some of the story on January 6th, which was when a bunch of my sources had been arrested. That was when Al Jazeera English did the first proper story, and I did the first live, and that was on the Arab Spring. And then the story just took off, and then it became Egypt, and we had a lot of journalists there. Al Jazeera sent a lot of journalists, and as soon as he fell. So
when did you go to Tunisia?
As soon as he fell.
You went with that first wave.
Yes.
Yeah. You spent a lot of time in Tunisia after that, and really inculcated yourself with Tunisian society. You've spent a lot of time living in Tunisia, but you left Al Jazeera.
Yes, I left Al Jazeera in 2013, mid-2013. It was a time when a lot of journalists were leaving Al Jazeera. A lot of the Arab Spring, also called Arab Spring, because as we know it didn't.
But you decided to freelance at that stage, and you were working for prestigious publications. But how hard is it to break into the freelance world of international journalism?
I think you have to be very strategic. One of the reasons I followed Tunisia is because I knew the story, and I had editors would trust me on Tunisia. Maybe if I was in Egypt or different places, it's a little bit harder to break through. But Tunisia, because there's not many English-speaking journalists who really know the topic, I think I've managed to carve out a niche through years of following the story. And I believe a lot in journalists carving out a niche. Even like Tunisia, when I started it, I didn't know it was going to become a huge international story. So I think that helped a lot. Knowing the language, I speak French. I've studied Arabic on and off, but Tunisian dialect is quite different. So I can have conversations in Tunisian dialect, very basic, but I do my interviews in French, but everyone is fluent in French. So that's not really an issue. Financially, even if you're writing for the big newspapers now, it is a struggle. So when I was freelancing, I would do TV on the side. And unfortunately, because of the economics of international journalism, for instance, when there's a big terrorist attack or something like that, that's when you make money. So
you have sort of lean periods and periods where you're earning well. You covered a number of terrorist activities. The Benghazi one would probably be the most well known. How long after the attack were you in Benghazi?
Benghazi, I was there by the Friday, so I think I arrived 2 days after. So the attack happened. We flew the next day. So that was a very interesting story to cover, and unfortunately, it was a turning point for Libya. It marked the beginning of the international withdrawal. Unfortunately, the international community withdrew after that attack.
Yeah.
And
you've written, however, from quite a large number of countries. I understand what you mean about carving a niche for yourself, but once you've established the contacts in each of these organisations, be they television or newspapers, does that make it easier then for you to go elsewhere and report on other subjects?
Yeah, absolutely. Once you have a certain reputation and once editors trust you and they know that you'll deliver, it does make it a lot easier, and it is good. I've now moved past Tunisia. I want to keep returning to cover the story, but it's important at a certain stage to get familiar with different areas. So I'm in Turkey now to become familiar with that, and also your regional knowing North Africa helps. Yeah, and you build.
Every foreign correspondent, of course, brings something different to the craft, but there are prerequisites, things that you have to have in order to carry out that function. What do you think the prerequisites for being a foreign correspondent are?
I think there's different types of foreign correspondents. So there's really
let's stick with the area that you work in, North Africa, the Middle East.
I think the type of journalism I do is a lot about speaking with ordinary people. So I think you have to be kind of a people person. You have to be able to listen. You can't go into a lot of these places and be rude or arrogant. Or, for instance, in Libya, if you're rude or arrogant, your life would be in danger. So you have to people get to know you as a person, and they give you information based on that. You establish relationships that last years. Algeria, I first went there as a 24-year-old, and a lot of the politicians I met then, they were all opposition. They're my age, and they were opposition activists at the time. A lot of them are in parliament now. One of them's the head of the opposition, and so you build these contacts, and they trust you. People in the Middle East and North Africa, they have a well-justified fear of foreigners. So if you just go in and they don't know your background, there's going to be a lot of distrust. So people like to know a bit about your motivations. They really do want to know you as a person, and that helps a lot, I think.
Did being a New Zealander help?
I think it did.
In other words, not a member of one of the colonial powers.
I think it did. It does and it doesn't. It depends. In North Africa, for instance, some of the more elite figures would rather deal with French journalists because they know the French. But ordinary people often helps being from New Zealand. In Turkey, it's interesting because they do have a deep grudge against the British. Americans right now, there's a diplomatic dispute where they're withdrawing visas. So in that context, being from New Zealand does help. They have a good feeling about New Zealanders for historic reasons.
Yeah. What about language? Now, you're fluent in French. North Africa is essentially, the exception of Egypt, a former French colonial area. How important was being able to speak French?
Yes, as working through a translator, when I have had to work through a translator in Libya, for instance, with Arabic, there's always a barrier, and the nuances that you need as a writer to really understand anything, the human nuances, or when someone's being subtle, or like to be able to read people when they're not telling you something, being able to speak the same language is very important. I do wish I could speak Arabic better, and it's really a work in progress. And that's why, as a student here, being able to study French and really master French was important to me, because once you're working, it's a lot harder to master a language. Yeah. It takes years. So I've done a little bit of Arabic, but I wish I was able to speak it better.
You've operated in some pretty dangerous environments. Have you done any hostile environment training?
Yeah, I've done a lot of hostile environment training. At Al Jazeera, when I first went, we hadn't. The digital journalists at that stage weren't really going into the field, and that all changed in 2011, and we were in the field all of a sudden, a lot of us without training. I had a colleague, Dorothy Pavaz, who disappeared in Syria. Fortunately, she was alive, and we got her back after a month, but that was a wake-up call, and there was a few similar things. So right after she got back, we all got sent for hostile environment training in the UK. And since then, there's Risk, which is a NGO for freelancers. So I've done their program in Kenya, and that's completely medical emergency first aid by people who are mainly military medics in Iraq and things like that.
Treating gunshot wounds and so on.
And they give you a pack. So I have and then I organised one in Tunisia for Tunisian journalists and foreign correspondents. So we brought trainers in, and they did it at affordable costs for everyone. So I've done quite a few, and yes, you do need to do these, and common sense. And I do meet a lot of younger journalists who are taking risks in places like Libya. They're not aware of the cultural thing. I had two Tunisian journalists I know who were killed in Libya, but they took a lot of risks that they shouldn't have. So it is fun. You need first aid, but you also need to really be aware of the country you're going into. You need to speak to people a lot. to avoid very stupid mistakes, which unfortunately a lot of people make.
I've yet to meet a foreign correspondent who says they've never been afraid. How important is fear?
I think fear and being cautious is very important. Despite being in a lot of high-risk situations, I'm also very cautious, which from someone who's not working in the field, it might not make sense. But when we go to Libya, for instance, I do things like you don't drive between cities, because that's when you get kidnapped. So when I go to Libya, I choose one place. You go to quite extreme lengths sometimes to fly in, which might mean flying via Malta in a tiny jet or something like that. And for instance, with the Tunisian journalists I know who were killed, they took a bus, and so they were just driving through. And because they weren't afraid enough. So I think fear, logical fear, and being...
Yes, it's not being cowardly, is it? It's being cautious.
Yes.
Yeah. What would you describe as the high point of your career so far?
I think definitely the days when Ben Ali had just fallen, was Zizi going to interview his mother. We did the first interview with him, and I was there when he spoke to the Arab world for the first time. So a colleague from Al Jazeera Arabic, the mother spoke to the Arab world for the first time. Those kind of moments, I think, would be...
They were heady days, the beginning of the Arab Spring. How do you feel about it now? Because a lot of the promise has evaporated.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. One of the reasons I stuck with Tunisia and went there as a freelancer is because all the other countries were going through very difficult things and very conflicts, and it was a very depressing story. And that's also why a lot of journalists I know who started out in 2011, a lot of them have left because it just becomes very depressing to cover that story, and you know all the people being locked up, that they become friends. So Tunisia for me, because it's the success story would be overstating it, and as a journalist you have to try and convey the nuances, because when there's a simple narrative, either this place is a failed state or this place is a success story, then the policies that follow tend to be simplistic. But Tunisia for me is the positive thing, because no matter there's a lot of very negative things happening. There's economic issues are worse in a lot of ways for ordinary people, but there is freedom of expression. There is a very strong civil society, and the younger Tunisians, everyone under 40 has a very different mindset from the older generation. So I have a lot of hope for Tunisia. I've learned a lot from seeing how people are building a democracy. So I think following Tunisia for me was a way of focusing on the positive. Syria obviously is,
not much positive.
Is a very depressing story. The international community has a lot of culpability for that story.
What's your personal low point? We can all be, we all see Syria and what's unfolding there as an international low point. But what's your personal low point in your career as an international journalist?
I think Al Jazeera by the early 2013, there was a lot of anger at Al Jazeera, in some cases quite rightly, because especially Al Jazeera Arabic, which is an amazing channel and has achieved a lot of amazing things, but some of the journalists there were more activists and unfortunately had a bias towards particular political movements, and that we started to feel the anger. So by mid-2013, when I went to Tunisia, a lot of people wouldn't speak to me because of Al Jazeera. And before that, people had always said, well, we know we're not going to speak to your colleagues at Al Jazeera Arabic, but we know you're reporting, so we'll speak to you. And there was a certain point where, especially with everything happening in Egypt, the region was so polarized. And then there was 2 Tunisian politicians, leftists, who were assassinated in 2013. And we weren't giving that I wasn't able to give those stories the same coverage, and there was that all led to me.
So personal
resigning.
integrity is very important to you, isn't it?
Yeah, and your reputation as a journalist, I think, is the most important thing, because if you lose your reputation, people don't speak to you anymore. So that was why I left.
Just finally, you are now working in a country where, since the attempted coup on President Erdogan, media have had a difficult time. Now, I know that you're not in a reporting role there; you're an editor. How difficult is it to live and work in a country that doesn't have the same attitudes towards freedom of expression that we might have in this country?
Yeah, I think it's good for me. I've actually found it very important to me to work in those circumstances, because freedom of speech, I think sometimes Western journalists have almost an arrogance, because it's very easy to work for Western media and write whatever you want to write. And journalists working in countries like Turkey or other countries, they have a different approach to the way they do journalism, and sometimes they will get criticized for that. I've seen Chinese colleagues, for instance, when I was on the fellowship in the US, people would give her a hard time, but she's working in a particular context where you have to. It doesn't mean that the journalist is. I mean, they just don't have the luxury of being completely outspoken, but they work in a different way. And I'm enjoying working with young Turkish journalists to see how they navigate that, and to stand up for them sometimes as a Western, we can kind of empower them in some ways. And Turkish journalists, I have a huge respect for them. There's thousands who are in prison. So there's a lot of very good journalists. So I'm learning a lot from working in that environment.
It must make you appreciate freedom of expression even more, though, when you see it either compromised or in some cases denied.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think in Western media there's different. Like, there isn't absolute freedom of expression. If I was to go to the Herald, for instance, and start writing about certain issues, I think that wouldn't go down very well. So I view it in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What advice would you have to the students who are going to be watching this video if they want to break into the market now that you are making a success of? What advice have you got for them?
Well, I think you have to be very tough now, because you're not going to get a correspondent position. Anyone who thinks straight that they're going to go out there and get a 5-year correspondent position where you're paid a reasonable salary, that's not how it works now. So you have to be tough, and you have to make good contacts. Your ability to get jobs, it depends a lot these days, unfortunately, on contacts in the media industry. So you have to hustle a lot, and you have to be versatile. You have to be able to jump from country to country and see where the opportunities take you. You have to keep your ethics and your personal integrity intact in a very complicated environment where it's not always it's not an ideal place or an ideal ecosystem. The media right now, whatever outlet you're working for, there's a lot of pressures to give in to clickbait or to give in to sensationalism, to focus on terrorism at the exclusion of other social issues. So you have to really know why you're a journalist and what you're trying to achieve.
Yasmine Ryan, thank you.
Thank you.